In today's webinar, Counterfeiters on the Rise, Challenges and Best Practices, we'll be discussing the latest trends and tactics fraudsters are using to promote counterfeit goods online and key best practices for an effective brand protection strategy. I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speaker for today's presentation. We're joined by brand protection expert, Akino Chikada. Akino is a senior product marketing manager for the MarkMonitor brand protection solution. She started her career in public relations and marketing in London and has worked in Europe, Asia, and the United States. She has led and served interim roles in global marketing strategies, product marketing, events management, public relations, corporate communications, and regional marketing. Akino holds a Bachelor of Arts from the University College of London and a Master of Science from the London School of Economics and has trilingual fluency in English, Italian, and Japanese. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn things over to Akino to get us started.
Thank you, Gina. Hi, everyone. Okay, so as Gina mentioned, today I'm going to be covering 4 different areas. We're going to first talk about the counterfeit landscape and trends, and then I'm going to show some real examples of the latest scams that we're seeing. And then we'll talk about effective enforcement tactics that you can use, and last but not least, best practices and key takeaways. So with that, let's start to talk about the landscape. So, especially with the holiday season, online counterfeiting is a major concern. So for this section, I wanted to cover 4 key areas of consideration. The first, as the digital world is taking over, opportunities for counterfeiting is on the rise. And unfortunately, counterfeit has a real impact to consumers. And from a brand owner's perspective, especially being that we're in the holiday season, there are a number of challenges and considerations. And lastly, from an industry perspective, there's a significant negative impact and cost associated with counterfeit. So with that said, let's review each section in more depth. Okay, so first things first, consumers now have more access to online counterfeit stores. 46% of the global population is now accessing the internet. That's 3.5 billion people that brand owners need to protect from any potential brand abuse. MarkMonitor recently conducted a market survey to better understand consumer shopping behavior and trends. And in this survey, the sample size consisted of approximately 3,500 consumers in 9 different countries, and we found that 36% of the consumers are shopping online. And during the holiday season, so now, it goes up to 40%. And throughout this presentation, I'll be sharing more of the compelling stats. I think that there's a lot of interesting statistics to share with you. And then the last area to consider is access to online store continues to grow. Consumers are now accessing online counterfeiting stores through paid search, email, e-commerce, social media, online marketplaces, mobile apps, even the deep web and dark web. So now shifting gears a little bit, let's talk about the impact this has to consumers. I wanted to call out a few interesting stats from the research we conducted. If you look on the right-hand side, there's a chart, and this shows the consumer shopping online statistics. And we have it broken down by country, so United Kingdom, USA, Germany, France, and it has a year-over-year comparison, so 2015 versus 2016, and broken by year-round versus shopping online activity trends during the holiday season. Overall, you'll see that shopping online has definitely increased from 2015 to 2016, and I particularly wanted to call out the USA. So in 2016, throughout this year, 45% of the people are shopping online compared to 39% last year. And for this holiday season, 48% of consumers are shopping online compared to 43% last year. So there's definite pressure for brand owners to stay vigilant and make sure that we're minimizing the amount of access and exposure consumers have to counterfeit. Unfortunately, 23% of the consumers have unwillingly purchased a fake product online. 51% of the respondents worry about buying a fake product online. I thought that was particularly interesting because it definitely showcases that there is a level of awareness that counterfeit is an issue. And 42% of the consumers are concerned about security of personal details and bank cards. So this plays to like consumer phishing scams that are taking place, malware, anything that, personal credentials are being stolen. So for brand owners, I thought these were additional interesting statistics to share. 18% of the shoppers have intentionally bought a counterfeit product. Now, what's scary about this is that the age range 18 to 34, that age range is more likely to buy a counterfeit good. So 28% of them said that they're proactively looking for counterfeit goods online. Clothing, women's handbag, watches, those were the top 3 fake products that were purchased. The second statistic I thought was extremely interesting for brand owners. 85% of consumers believe that brands should be doing more to protect them. And in fact, 12% said that they wouldn't buy from that brand again, and 59% said that it would make them more cautious when buying that specific brand's product in future. These stats show that brand owners do need to prioritize online counterfeiting as a business problem and make sure that they have a proactive stance towards this. And of course, unfortunately, counterfeiters don't make life easy for brand owners. They're adopting more sophisticated MOs, including new channels and increased volumes, evolving tactics. They're using new software and tools. And throughout my examples, I'll be showcasing some of these new tactics. Another area of consideration for brand owners is that beyond counterfeit, there are other online brand abuse scams. So, for example, trademark abuse, copyright abuse, impersonation, false association, traffic diversion, unauthorized seller, fraud. These are all types of abuse that really impact the consumer, and it happens across multiple different channels and many times at the same time, so in parallel. So it's really important for brand owners to be aware of all of these different types of abuse that is happening across all of these different channels. So I wanted to share an example of how counterfeit has a tremendous impact to an industry. And I kind of picked on the apparel and footwear industry right now. I found this really interesting research. It's a European report, and it's estimated that in the apparel and footwear industry, 26.3 billion euros of revenue is lost due to counterfeiting per year, which corresponds to 9.7% of the sector's sales. The other stat to call out is the fact that the loss of sales directly impacted 363,000 jobs. So these stats really highlight the fact that there's a social and economic impact to counterfeiting. Now, the second chart that I have is from The Economist. It's not limited to the apparel and footwear industry. It's stats from the U.S. Homeland Security and the European Commission. The chart shows the types of counterfeit goods that are being seized at the borders. And in the U.S., you can see watches and jewelry, handbags and wallets, clothing, pharmaceutical and personal care, footwear, consumer electronics, and others were the key things that were seized at the U.S. borders. And for the European Union, watches, handbags and wallets, clothing, sunglasses, perfumes and cosmetics, sporting, shoes, and others were seized. Overall, estimates for the total value of fakes sold worldwide each year goes as high as $1.8 trillion. So this just yet again highlights the magnitude and the impact counterfeit has to our businesses. So let's talk about some real-life examples. As I mentioned before, consumers shop online for counterfeit goods through different channels, whether it's through e-commerce sites, social media, marketplaces, banner ads, mobile apps. They can get exposed to counterfeit stores in many different ways. So I'm going to walk you through some real examples that we've seen. And actually, on this particular slide, the top left-hand side, it's a funny one to kind of call out. There's this counterfeit advertisement. It's promoting a jacket, says sale 70%, buy now. Now, I don't know if you can see in the small print, but it has the generic, the standard filler text that graphic designers often use, so it's like lorem ipsum. Now, the counterfeiter in this case was so lazy, they forgot to even delete that piece. So I thought that was a funny one to kind of call out. So let's start talking about websites. One of the key tactics counterfeiters often use is they use the brand in the domain at the domain level. And what we've seen is that especially when brand owners are putting together an effective brand protection strategy together and they're starting to enforce, one of the trends that we've seen is that counterfeiters are becoming more savvy. So they know that the likelihood of being detected and enforced on is much higher if they use the traditional brand in the domain website. So as an example, we looked at one of our clients, and on the right-hand side, you'll see a chart. What you can see is after persistent enforcement on the traditional counterfeit domain, the counterfeiter's tactics has actually evolved. So instead of using cheapbrand.com or wholesalebrand.com, it's now being replaced with harder-to-find domains. And counterfeiters are moving to all sorts of different naming schemes to avoid detection and using social media and other avenues to drive traffic. By the way, please note that the chart does not indicate that the website infringement is becoming less of an issue. It's just representing the evolution of counterfeiters' behavior, especially as someone, a brand owner, is taking aggressive enforcement strategies in place. For this next example, this is an example of a counterfeiter using social media to then direct traffic to an e-commerce site. Through social media, counterfeiters are targeting fans of a popular TV show and creating false associations by photoshopping the actor's head wearing the unauthorized T-shirt. From there, they promote a link and direct traffic to a counterfeit e-commerce page. So false association is definitely one of the tactics counterfeiters tend to use, so it's important to be aware of this. The deep web is another example of how counterfeiters are now evolving their tactics, again, to promote their counterfeit sites. Counterfeiters are now applying specific code at the source code level to make their page unindexed. So actually, if you look at that little screenshot I have highlighted the section where it says no index, no follow. That's the code that counterfeiters put. And essentially what it means is that brand owners and consumers now won't be able to find that particular site when they go and try to search via a search engine. In order to get to that site, a counterfeiter will promote it through social media, advertisement, emails, essentially in a more targeted approach. But counterfeiters are now using this tactic more often because they're finding that it's harder for the brand owner to actually detect these types of e-commerce pages. So overall, when it comes to websites, some high-level best practices. Traditional website infringement is evolving, especially if you have a brand protection program already in place. It's good that it's definitely important for you to be aware that counterfeiters are going to evolve their tactics and try to progress into new things. However, as a brand owner, constant enforcement and persistence is extremely important. Send out CMDs and having technology to help you throughout this process is actually very important. Also, know your escalation options. So you have UDRP, URS, register notice, false who is, litigation. Know your different escalation options and apply it if when necessary. Now let's look at some marketplaces examples. This is a traditional counterfeit listing on a marketplace. There are different telltale signs for spotting a counterfeit, but I thought this one was particularly interesting to call out. If you could see at the bottom, there's the commentary section. It says, "Love these. I cannot tell a difference between these and actual Vans." So obviously this is a counterfeit site, and obviously it's been taken down. But I thought that was a good example to share. This, what you're looking at, is a new trend that we're now seeing. The more sophisticated counterfeiters are now posting images on a third-party image hosting site. So this example is a Chinese one called Youpu, and essentially consumers can now get in touch with the person that posted it, so it could be a counterfeiter, and then the counterfeiter will send them a private link to their counterfeit webpage. And for this particular example, the counterfeiter made a mistake and included the legitimate brand's logo, so we were able to enforce on this. But this is another example of evolving tactics and sneakiness from the counterfeiter side. This is an example. These are more traditional counterfeit marketplace listings in China, and these are counterfeit jackets. And actually, what's interesting about this is if you contact them, these counterfeiters are actually willing to put whatever brand name or logo that they want. So it's extremely important, again, for brand owners to be vigilant and monitor Chinese marketplaces sites and make sure that there's no counterfeit being sold to enforce on these. So again, some high-level best practices. Make sure you leverage technology to increase your scope of detection. Make sure you have the correct IP rights in areas where your products are being infringed. And this is an area I'm going to spend more time talking about when we talk about effective enforcement strategies. And last but not least, consistent enforcement is crucial to have an impact. So let's talk about and let's look at social media as an example. So on the top left-hand side, this is an example of a social media page that drives people to counterfeit sites. So what you see here, for example, is www.beststuffsforyou.net. And basically on these sites, they're trying to redirect consumers to a counterfeit page. In the middle, top middle, this is a person who's impersonating an employee to get more customer information. So impersonation is something to be very aware of in the social media channel, and definitely something that you should be enforcing on. On the right-hand side, there's a YouTube video of a counterfeit jersey, and in the commentary section, they post a link to their counterfeit page so that people can purchase that counterfeit jersey. And then on the bottom middle examples, these are Instagram posts where they're promoting counterfeit sites. So as you can see, social media, even through social media across the different social media platforms, there are definitely different ways for people to be promoting counterfeit and brand abuse. So definitely be aware of that. In terms of best practices, it's really important to have an established policy in place. And when it comes to social media, some things to consider is things like freedom of speech. So being very aware of terms and conditions and what is enforceable and not enforceable, and having a policy around that is very important. And if you have affiliates or partners that are authorized sellers, it's good practice to have a template for them and clearly distinguish who the authorized affiliates are. That way, there's no confusion between a fan page versus an authorized affiliate. Also, ensure that traffic is being sent and directed to your own homepage or to approved affiliate destinations. Definitely do not want to see people directing consumers to a counterfeit site. And last but not least, constantly monitor and make sure that, there's no abuse actually taking place, and that, the social media platform is clean and your brand is being represented appropriately. Now, I wanted to give you an example on search results and search engines. One of the tactics that counterfeiters are using is kind of scary, but it's called SEO poisoning, which is essentially traffic diversion on search engines leading to e-commerce sites. So what essentially is happening is infringers are injecting counterfeit URLs into legitimate sites to avoid detection. And here on the right-hand side, you could see some examples. There are links, and it looks like it's promoting a counterfeit site. What's scary is that if you look at the green URL or domain, that is actually a legitimate law firm's URL. And what's interesting is that if you click on this, then you do get directed to the counterfeit site. However, if you were to type the green URL code directly, then you go to the legitimate, in this case, law firm site. Now, this tactic is often used because, it shows up as higher ranked on Google. But what ends up happening is that it does cause tremendous brand confusion, and consumers get very confused. And what's worse is that many of the site owners have no idea that they've been infected, and they don't even know about this. So please be aware that SEO poisoning is yet another tactic counterfeiters are using. The good news is that search engines such as Google, Yahoo, Bing, they all have very extensive enforcement terms and conditions. So as a brand owner, it's often really helpful for you to be well versed in this. I know that this is a chart and it's kind of overwhelming. I'm not going to go through each one of them, but I definitely wanted to highlight that you could definitely enforce based on trademark, copyright, counterfeit. There are different ways and means for you to be able to enforce on these effectively. Now, last but not least, mobile apps. Mobile apps are on the rise, and infringers are often packing numerous different types of infringements into a single app. So the example I have right here shows actually that this one particular app is selling counterfeit goods, and there's copyright, trademark abuse. They're also promoting unauthorized content. So there's a lot going on in this particular app. And what's obviously terrible about this is that while they're pretending to be a legitimate authorized app, so there's that false association aspect also happening. Now, established app stores do have a good process to reach out to developers and take down these types of apps. Third-party app stores, they're less mature, so they need a bit more follow-up. However, it is something that brand owners are definitely more and more aware of, and it's definitely an area where, please be aware of. Okay, so now that I probably scared you all, it's probably a good time to start talking about effective enforcement strategies. Three key things I really wanted to highlight and talk about in more details is, first, it's imperative that you build a strong IP portfolio. Second, really it's important to understand the scope and priorities so that you can enforce effectively. And third, it's important to know the nuances of regional monitoring and enforcement policies. Of course, it goes without saying that it's best practices to do a combination of all of these. So let's start by talking about building a strong IP portfolio. Now, especially if you're a global company, it might be easier to do this, but take advantage of local resources and local expertise to verify the strength of your trademark rights. Depending obviously on your product, one of the really beneficial and effective ways to enforce is if you could put together a reference library of all your copyrighted images for both past and present, it really makes a big difference. So for example, if your product is seasonal, or if you have new versions of your different product, having it all documented and centralized will help you when you see a counterfeit. Often counterfeiters will use a version from 2013 or an older version. So if you have it all documented, you could go back to your centralized libraries. You will be able to clearly articulate, okay, this I know is counterfeiting for a fact, and then be able to communicate that and enforce that effectively. The third thing is, of course, if you have a patent portfolio, similar to how we talked about for the copyright and trademark enforcement efforts, that's very important to have a centralized library for patents as well. And lastly, this is probably especially true if you're acquiring a new brand or if there's a handoff. But essentially, having the original letters of authorization is very important. And being able to prove the chain of custody of the registered trademark owners is very important. Because if you can't prove that you are the legitimate owner of that trademark, when you want to go and enforce, it makes it really, really challenging. So having all of that documented, centralized, very, very important. Okay, so let's talk about understanding the scope and prioritizing enforcement. Depending obviously on the stage of where you are, it's always important to have a good grasp of how big of your problem or online problem is. So if you're new to a brand protection program, starting off with a landscape report just to get a good understanding of where your biggest pain points are is always beneficial. And the ultimate goal here is to disrupt the counterfeiters and become the hardest target. The harder you become and the more you enforce, then you're making their counterfeiters' life so much harder. So regular enforcement, regular monitoring, regular, with discipline to be able to do that consistently, that really, really makes a big impact and discourages counterfeiters and have them move on to a different brand. The third thing to highlight here is it's important to prioritize and escalate enforcement, especially for persistent sellers. So know who your high-value targets are. Who are those bad sellers that, are constantly selling counterfeit goods? Know who those are, and do control buys to identify the supplier. The other good nugget to know is that every marketplace has a demerit system, meaning each marketplace, if there's a repeat offender, there is typically a program where brand owners can leverage and ban that repeat offender seller from ever being able to sell from that marketplace. So make sure you know about all of these different types of programs and policies, because you could definitely take advantage of that and help you have a more effective brand protection enforcement strategy in place. Same goes with the marketplace ban list. So the third thing is importance of regional monitoring and enforcement. And I know China has always been a major issue for many brand owners. If at any point in time you're actually considering to launch a product or start selling your product in China, my one advice is to immediately go register for all the relevant trademarks as soon as possible. China is a first-to-file country with a very complicated trademark system. So if you're even contemplating it, then you're better off just registering and playing it safe, because what you don't want is someone to get wind that you might potentially be launching a product and then having that third person purchasing your trademark before you do, because they will have the rights to your trademark. Also, when you're registering, make sure you register both English and Chinese versions, and be proactive with your Chinese branding strategy. I know that choose a Chinese name before your consumers do might sound a little interesting, but essentially we've seen cases where consumers will sometimes name the product in the localized form, and brand owners don't even recognize that it's their own product because they didn't have a Chinese version of their name. And so be proactive in it, register those trademarks, have a Chinese name for it, be aware of all those cultural nuances so that you're, making sure that you set the record straight and that you are setting yourself up for success. And then the last part is be prepared to meet country-specific requirements. In short, don't fall short on nuances. Make sure you have all the original copies of trademark registration certificates. There are certainly some marketplaces that require original copies, so be aware of that and have that all in place. Now, I know this list seems overwhelming, so I am not going to go through each and every one of these. However, I did want to call out 4 of them. So as you've seen in the examples I shared with you, I think it's imperative for people or brand owners to be prepared to constantly evolve your enforcement strategies. As counterfeiters are, using new tactics, I think it's important to stay ahead of that and be aware of that and make sure your enforcement plans are all up to speed with that. The second one I want to call out is use industry groups to strengthen influence against key marketplaces, especially depending on what industry you are. Having a group of people and a network of people can certainly help make your case stronger. Thirdly, region-specific representation. I know I just talked about China, but this is global, so from a global standpoint, if you have local resources and you have local expertise, it really enhances and helps improve enforcement policies and making sure that all of the local nuances really makes a good impact to your brand protection program. Last but not least, investigate your investigators. Now, I don't want to scare you, but this is an example, again, in China. But sometimes investigators will be working with both sides. So they'll be working with the brand owners and the counterfeiters. So it's good practice to every now and then audit your investigators to make sure that they are just working for you. Okay, so let's talk about best practices. Overall, be proactive. Rather than waiting for your client or consumer to complain about being a victim of a counterfeit, it's really beneficial if you already have a brand protection program in place so that you're constantly and proactively monitoring and enforcing. Leverage technology. There are purpose-built technology out there that will help detect, analyze, and enforce, especially against counterfeiters and brand abuse. And third one, don't just focus on one channel. It might be compelling to just focus on marketplaces or e-commerce sites, but the reality is that, as you've seen throughout the examples, counterfeit can be promoted across all of these different channels. So be aware of all of them and stay vigilant. So from a brand owner's perspective, understanding your consumer is really key. And I wanted to share a few more stats from the research we've done. As you know, consumers remain concerned about online scams, and people are relying more on customer reviews and opinions. So on this right-hand side, there's a chart, consumers checking the legitimacy of the website. What I thought was really interesting was that in 2016, consumer really relied on consumer reviews, and it's quite a significant jump from 2015. So from 30% to 48%. And just knowing that and being able to be aware that that's what consumers are looking for is interesting. Also, out of the consumers we interviewed, 58% had most confidence in clicking a brand website listing, 38% were most confident in marketplaces listing, and people felt less confident when it came to sponsored links, 18%, and adverts on the right-hand side of search results, 13%. Which leads me to my very final point. Make education, especially to your customers, a priority. And actually not just your customers, even internal employees, every stakeholder, everybody that, as brand owners, it's always good to train your employees on brand abuse, but also your customers. And it really makes a difference when you can make your customers your allies in fighting counterfeit activities. So a good way to do that is you could set up easy methods for customers to get in touch with you. Have a page on your website or like in your social media where you can talk about scams and also help make it really easy. Have an email available so clients can just email you something to get validated whether or not it's legitimate or not. The other best practices on your website, it's great to be able to showcase who the authorized sellers are. That way, if a consumer is in doubt whether or not this third party is truly an authorized seller or not, they could just go to your website. Either they could purchase directly from you, or they could validate that this company is actually a real affiliate and it's legitimate. So having customers and your clients be part of this fight against counterfeiters is definitely a great best practice. So with that, I am going to open up for questions. I see that there's been a lot of questions coming in. Thank you. Okay, so one of the questions is, how do brand owners typically prioritize where to begin enforcing? Great question. I personally recommend doing a landscape report and determining where exactly the biggest pain point is, depending on product, depending on your company and what you're selling. It could really vary. So understanding that weakness and then taking it from that approach is definitely a good tactic. I see a question where it says, would it be possible to have a copy of this presentation? Yes. I know that we'll be sending out an email following this webinar in a couple of days, and you'll have access to the presentation and the recording. Another question is, how can brand owners efficiently detect counterfeit goods online? Well, there are different ways. Two things I would probably call out. One, I think that technology certainly helps, especially considering the breadth and how much there's out there. I think that is definitely technology to help automate the process certainly helps. And also it goes without saying, a certain level of expertise as you go through the different listings, being able to acknowledge and identify the different telltale signs. You know, there is a level of expertise that kicks in, so that is definitely a good way into putting together an efficient way to detect counterfeit. Let's see, other questions. So one of the questions is, seems like repeat offender policies are circumvented with fake names. How do you combat this? That's a very good question, and actually, to my point earlier, if you, there are multiple ways, and there are different tactics, and this is, I guess, where expertise really helps. Being able to see the different, so you don't just look at the domain name at the domain level. You actually need to go through and be able to see and identify it, the actual listing or e-commerce site. So having an automated way to do that is definitely an easier way to go through and actually sift through all of this different potential content.